They called her the janitor nurse, night shift, bottom of the hierarchy, invisible. The ER chief barely looked at her when he barked the order. Patient in trauma 3 is gone. Clean the bay. But she walked in anyway. What she saw made her blood freeze. The patient wasn't gone. He was dying, monitors flat, no pulse, 3 minutes without oxygen. The chief had given up. She hadn't held a scalpel in 7 years, not since Kandahar, not since the incident that destroyed her career and buried her in this basement shift. But those hands, they remembered everything. What happened in the next 11 minutes would end up in military medical textbooks and force the chief to answer one question. Who was this nurse? They called her the janitor nurse, night shift, bottom of the hierarchy, invisible. The ER chief barely looked at her when he barked the order. Patient in trauma 3 is gone. Clean the bay. But she walked in anyway. What she saw made her blood freeze. The patient wasn't gone. He was dying. Monitors flat, no pulse, 3 minutes without oxygen. The chief had given up. She hadn't held a scalpel in 7 years, not since Kandahar, not since the incident that destroyed her career and buried her in this basement shift. But those hands, they remembered everything. What happened in the next 11 minutes would end up in military medical textbooks and force the chief to answer one question. Who was this nurse? Lieutenant Commander Ava Winters, former title, former life, former everything. Now she was just Ava, night shift floor nurse at Cedar Memorial Hospital, the nurse who restocked supplies, who cleaned bays, who charted vitals and kept her mouth shut when doctors made rounds. 2:47 a.m. The ER stretched empty and sterile under fluorescent lights. Skeleton crew, 2 residents, 1 attending, Dr. Bernard Walsh, chief of surgery, 30 years at Cedar Memorial, God complex fully intact. Walsh's philosophy was simple. Know when to call it. Don't waste resources on lost causes. He said it often, proudly, like it was wisdom instead of surrender. Ava had flagged the patient 20 minutes earlier. John Doe, motorcycle accident, vitals deteriorating faster than the chart showed. She'd approached Walsh in the hallway, tablet in hand, concern measured in her voice. The vitals are dropping too quickly. BP's unstable. Respiratory rate is climbing. Walsh hadn't even looked up from his phone. I've been doing this since you were in diapers, nurse. Chart your observations and let me do the medicine. She'd returned to the supply closet, the lowest task on the totem pole, counting gauze packages, restocking suture kits, disappearing into the infrastructure of the hospital like she'd been doing for 7 years. 7 years of hiding, 7 years of penance. At 2:51 a.m., the code blue alarm shrieked through the emergency department, Trauma 3. Walsh arrived first. Eva watched from the supply room doorway as he moved through the protocol, checked the monitors. Flatline. Checked for pulse. Nothing. Pupils fixed and dilated. Time of death, 2:53 a.m. He turned to Eva without ceremony. Patient's gone. Prep the bay for cleaning. I'll do the paperwork. He walked out, already on his phone, already moving to the next thing, the next patient, the next decision. Eva stood in the doorway holding a mop bucket. That's what 7 years of hiding looked like. A mop bucket, a cart of cleaning supplies, permission to enter only after death had been declared. She pushed the cart into Trauma 3 at 2:56 a.m. The body lay still on the gurney, sheet pulled to mid-chest, monitor silent, no alarms, no beeps, no rhythm of life. But something was wrong. Ava had seen death, real death, the kind that came in desert trauma tents with sand in the wounds and the sound of mortars in the distance. She knew what death looked like. This wasn't it. The angle of his head, slightly hyperextended, the color around his lips, dusky, not the pale white of exsanguination or the blue of hypoxia, but something in between. She moved closer. Professional instinct overrode protocol. Her hand reached for his neck, found the pulse point, pressed and felt it. Massive subcutaneous emphysema, air trapped under the skin, crackling like bubble wrap beneath her fingertips, extending from neck to chest. The realization hit like ice water. Tension pneumothorax. The air pressure had collapsed his lung, was compressing his heart. The heart couldn't beat against the pressure, couldn't generate enough force to create a pulse, couldn't pump blood. The monitors showed flatline because functionally he was flat, but not dead, suffocating from the inside. Eva's hands began to shake. 7 years. 7 years since she'd held a scalpel. 7 years since Kandahar. 7 years since Captain Morrison died on her table because she'd made the wrong cut, the wrong choice, the wrong decision in a tent full of impossible decisions. The military tribunal had been clear, no fault. But emotionally, unfit for combat surgical duty. She'd chosen discharge over a desk, chosen to disappear, chosen to become invisible. Hospital protocol was clear. Nurses don't perform procedures. Her medical license was still active, technically. But surgical privileges? Revoked, gone, buried with her military career. The math was simple and brutal. Maybe 4 minutes of brain viability left, if that. No time to get Walsh back, no time to call another surgeon, no time to follow protocol or cover herself legally or do anything except act. Her hands shook harder. But muscle memory lived deeper than fear. 3 seconds to decide. Decision made. Ava's movements became automatic, calculated, precise, gloves on. Betadine swab across the second intercostal space. No time for proper sterile field, no time for draping, no time for anything except the procedure itself. She palpated the landmarks, second rib, mid-clavicular line, the space between where trapped air was crushing the life out of him. Scalpel from the crash cart. Her hands steadied, one clean incision through skin and muscle. The sound was violent, explosive, a hiss of trapped air erupting outward like a punctured tire. The force of it sprayed mist across her face shield. She grabbed the chest tube, 14 gauge, inserted it through the incision, connected to suction. 10 seconds later, the monitor beeped. 20 seconds, rhythm appeared, erratic but present. 30 seconds, blood pressure rising, 60/40, 75/45, 45 seconds. The patient gasped, a huge shuddering inhalation, chest expanding, life returning in a rush of oxygen and restored circulation. Eva stepped back, gloves bloody, hands steady now, the procedure complete. That's when she heard footsteps. Dr. Kwan, the second-year resident, appeared in the doorway. He must have heard the monitor from the hallway, heard the change from silence to beeping. Came running. He saw Eva, saw her hands, saw the chest tube, saw the patient breathing. What the hell? Who are you? Eva opened her mouth to answer, but another voice cut through from behind Kwan. What have you done? Dr. Walsh filled the doorway, face red, eyes wide, staring at the scene like he'd walked into a nightmare. The patient he'd declared dead was breathing. The nurse he'd dismissed was standing over him with bloody gloves and a chest tube in place. Walsh's voice rose to a roar. That patient was declared dead. You just performed surgery without authorization. You're not even a doctor here. You're a nurse. Eva met his eyes. Her voice came out quiet, steady, the same voice she'd used in Kandahar when the world was exploding and someone needed to stay calm. He wasn't dead. Tension, pneumothorax. You missed it. The monitor beeped steadily behind her. The patient's chest rose and fell, blood pressure climbing toward normal on the display. Evidence. Walsh's face went from red to purple. Security. Now. But before anyone could move, before security could be called, before Walsh could do anything except stand there in impotent rage, the monitor alarm shrieked again. The patient was coding. Again. The alarm cut through everything, sharp, insistent, unmistakable. The patient's blood pressure dropped like a stone. 90/60, 75/50, 60/40. Walsh froze mid-sentence. His call for security died in his throat. Kwan moved first, grabbed the tablet, pulled up the CT scans from admission. His eyes went wide. Ruptured spleen, grade 4 laceration. He needs surgery, now. Walsh recovered his composure, his authority, that iron certainty that 30 years of practice had welded into his spine. He's being transferred to county. Not my problem anymore. Eva's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. He'll die in transport. 40 minutes minimum. Walsh turned on her, eyes hard, voice harder. Then he dies. You've done enough damage. Eva stared at the monitors, at the numbers dropping in real time, at the life slipping away because pride mattered more than protocol. Because ego mattered more than evidence. 15 minutes. Maybe? The patient had maybe 15 minutes before hemorrhagic shock became irreversible. That's when the voice came from the hallway. "Lieutenant Commander Winters?" Eva froze. That rank, that title. No one here knew that rank. No one here knew anything except that she was a night shift nurse who kept her head down and her history buried. An elderly man stepped into the doorway. Late 70s, ramrod posture despite his age, silver hair, sharp eyes. He'd been sitting in the hallway the entire time, quiet, waiting. Walsh turned to him with barely concealed irritation. "Sir, you need to leave. This is a sterile area." The man ignored him completely, his eyes locked on Eva. "I was at the Kandahar inquiry. I know who you are. I know what happened." The room went silent, except for the monitor alarms. Walsh's voice held confusion and growing anger. "What are you talking about?" The elderly man stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of command. "That nurse is one of the finest trauma surgeons the Navy ever produced. Lieutenant Commander Eva Winters, top of her class at Johns Hopkins, recruited specifically for forward surgical teams, 23 months in Kandahar, 347 successful combat surgeries, 98% survival rate, the highest in theater." Kwan's mouth fell open. Walsh looked like he'd been struck. The man extended his hand to Eva, "Retired Admiral James Kowalski. And that patient is my son." Eva's world tilted. The father. Of course. The motorcycle accident, the young man on the table. She looked at Kowalski and saw Morrison's face, saw the funeral, saw the two daughters in black dresses standing by a flag-draped coffin. 7 years collapsed into this moment. Walsh found his voice first. "If she's such a talented surgeon, what's she doing working night shifts as a floor nurse?" Kowalski's expression hardened. "Because she made an impossible choice in an impossible situation, and the Navy rewarded her honesty with a tribunal. The words opened a floodgate Eva had kept sealed for 7 years. The memories came in fragments, sharp, cutting, real. Kandahar, summer 2017, the trauma tent that never stopped filling, the heat that made surgical gloves stick to your hands, the sound of helicopters bringing in the wounded, the sound of mortars in the distance promising more. Captain Derek Morrison, Marine, IED blast, catastrophic injuries but savable if she moved fast enough, if she prioritized correctly, if she made the right choice. Except there were 3 other critical patients, all arriving simultaneously, all dying. She'd made the calculation, stabilized the 3. Then Morrison, 5 minutes. She could stabilize 3 patients in 5 minutes and still have time for Morrison. But Morrison coded during those 5 minutes. She'd performed an emergency thoracotomy, cracked his chest right there in the tent, reached into his thoracic cavity, and manually compressed his heart. For 7 minutes she'd squeezed his heart with her own hands, trying to force life back into tissue that had already given up. He died anyway. The tribunal had reviewed everything, found no fault, no breach of protocol, no negligence, just an impossible situation where someone had to die and she'd chosen to save 3 instead of 1. No fault, but emotional trauma suggests unfitness for combat surgical duty, medical discharge, or desk duty. Those were her options. She'd chosen discharge, chosen to disappear, chosen to become someone who restocked supplies and kept her mouth shut. "I saved 3 that night, but I only remember the one I lost." Eva spoke the words without realizing. They just emerged. 7 years of silence breaking in a single sentence. Kowalski nodded slowly. "Morrison had 2 daughters, 7 and 9 years old. You attended the funeral." Eva closed her eyes, saw their faces. The older one holding her sister's hand, both of them trying. So hard to be brave. "I haven't picked up a scalpel since that day. Until 17 minutes ago." The monitor alarm screamed louder. Blood pressure hit 55/35. Kwan's voice cut through the emotion. "Dr. Walsh, we need to operate now." Walsh shook his head, stubborn, defensive, cornered. "I said county. This hospital doesn't have the resources for major trauma surgery at 3 in the morning. Kowalski stepped forward. His voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "My son dies because you're too proud to admit you missed a tension pneumothorax, and I'll make sure the board knows you declared him dead while his heart was still beating." Standoff. Eva stared at the monitors, at the blood pressure dropping, at the time running out. She knew exactly what needed to happen. Exploratory laparotomy, open the abdomen, find the bleeder, clamp it, stop the hemorrhage before shock became irreversible. But she hadn't done abdominal surgery in 7 years, hadn't held a scalpel for anything more complex than the chest tube she'd just placed. Her hands started shaking again. Walsh pointed at her. "You're not touching him. You're not even authorized. You're a nurse. You don't have privileges, you don't have credentials, you don't have anything except a revoked surgical license and a history of poor judgment." The words landed like physical blows. But Quan spoke. Quiet. Certain. "I am. I can authorize an emergency procedure. I'm an attending as of last month. Junior attending, but attending." He turned to Eva, met her eyes. "Can you do this?" Eva looked at the monitors, 50/30, looked at Kowalski, at a father watching his son die, looked at her hands, still shaking, still remembering. "Yes." Walsh exploded. "This is your career, Quan, and yours, Winters. Don't come crying to me when the board strips your license and the lawsuits start rolling in." He stormed out, footsteps echoing down the hallway, running from responsibility, running from consequences. Eva moved toward the scrub room on autopilot. Quan followed. The water ran hot over her hands. She watched them shake under the stream, watched the tremor that 7 years of hiding had created. 7 years of telling herself she wasn't a surgeon anymore, wasn't capable, wasn't worthy. Quan entered the scrub room, started his own prep, spoke without looking at her. "I looked you up while you were talking. Naval medical records are partially public if you know where to search. 347 surgeries, 98% survival rate." Eva kept scrubbing, methodical, precise, trying to find the rhythm her hands used to know. 98% means 7 people died. I remember every single one. Quan nodded. "So do I. Every surgeon does. I've been practicing for 3 years. Lost 4 patients. I see their faces every time I close my eyes." He paused, met a reflection in the mirror above the sink. "But 340 people are alive because of you. 340 people went home, had families, had lives, because you made the right call even when the right call meant someone died." Ava's hands steadied. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. She looked at Quan. "Let's make it 341. They moved toward the operating room, toward the patient, toward the impossible choice that had found her again after 7 years of hiding. Eva's hands remembered, and this time, she wouldn't run. 3:47 a.m. The operating room blazed with light, cold, sterile, perfect. Dr. Patel, the night anesthetist, had arrived within minutes, curious about the commotion, curious about the night nurse standing at the operating table in surgical scrubs, but professional enough not to ask questions when a patient was dying. Patient prepped, anesthesia administered, monitors beeping steady rhythm for now. Ava stood over the draped body, scalpel in hand, the weight familiar, terrifying. Right, first incision, midline laparotomy. Clean line from sternum to pubis. Her hands didn't shake now. Muscle memory took over. 7 years dissolved. The operating room in Cedar Memorial became the trauma tent in Kandahar. The monitors became the sound of helicopters. The smell of betadine became the smell of sand and blood. She was home. Quan assisted across from her, watching in real time as Eva's hands moved, retractors placed, tissue separated. The abdomen opened like a book revealing its secrets. And there it was. Grade 4 splenic laceration, actively hemorrhaging, blood pooling in the abdominal cavity, the spleen practically torn in half. Patel's voice cut through the focused silence, BPs dropping, 55/35. Ava's response was immediate, automatic, the voice of command she'd buried for 7 years. Massive transfusion protocol. And get me lap pads. Her hands moved faster, packing the abdomen with surgical sponges to control the bleeding, finding the splenic artery through touch and memory, isolating it, clamping it. The bleeding stopped. Quan stared. "You're doing this faster than I've ever seen." Eva didn't look up. Focused, precise, already beginning the splenectomy. The spleen had to come out, too damaged, too destroyed. Did 23 of these in Kandahar. Had to. Every second counted with incoming wounded. Combat surgery techniques in a civilian setting, brutal efficiency married to surgical elegance, no wasted movements, no hesitation, every cut deliberate, every suture exact. The spleen came out. Eva placed it in the surgical basin, checked for other bleeding, started to close. 4:12 a.m., but the monitor alarm sounded again. Blood pressure still dropping, 60/40, not stabilizing. Eva's hands paused, instinct screaming. There's another bleeder. Somewhere. She explored the abdomen, methodical, systematic, checking every vessel, every organ, every space where blood could hide, and found it. Lacerated superior mesenteric artery, hidden behind loops of bowel, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, but fatal, absolutely fatal. Kwan's voice held awe and confusion. How did you even see that? Ava's hands worked, exposing the vessel, preparing to repair it, saw it 3 times in theater. Same presentation, motorcycle accidents mimic blast patterns. Outside the operating room, word had spread through the hospital like wildfire. The observation window filled with staff, night shift nurses, residents, even some patients' families who'd heard the commotion. Whispers filtered through the glass. Who is she? Where did she come from? One of the older nurses pressed closer to the window, squinted. Recognition dawned. Wait, isn't that the night nurse from 4 West? 4:31 a.m. The door to the observation room burst open. Dr. Walsh entered. Not alone. Hospital Administrator Karen Feldman beside him, head of security trailing behind. Walsh's face was red, triumphant, ready for vindication. He grabbed the intercom, stopped the procedure immediately. Eva didn't stop working, didn't even look up. Her hands continued suturing. The mesenteric artery. Precise. Controlled. Perfect. Feldman's voice came through the speaker. Authoritative. Legal. Ms. Winters, you're not credentialed at this hospital for surgical procedures. This is a liability issue. You need to stop. Eva tied off a suture, started the next one. 10 more minutes. Walsh leaned into the intercom. This is a liability nightmare. The patient's family will sue. The hospital will be destroyed. Stop now. Admiral Kowalski stepped forward in the observation room. His voice carried the weight of decades of command. I'm the patient's family. She has my full consent. Feldman turned to him. Sir, that's not how this works. Hospital credentialing exists for patient safety. We have protocols. But Kwan wasn't listening to the argument. He was staring at the patient's chart on the monitor, scrolling through the pre-admission scans. His face went pale. Dr. Walsh, these scans. The pneumothorax was visible 2 hours ago. Silence in the observation room. Eva glanced at the screen while continuing to suture. Her hands never stopped moving. He missed it? Kwan's voice was quiet, horrified. No. He ordered contrast first for the CT scan. The protocol is chest X-ray, then contrast only if the patient is stable. The realization hit everyone simultaneously. Walsh's procedure had made it worse. The contrast CT had increased the air pressure, had accelerated the lung collapse, had pushed the patient into cardiac arrest, and then Walsh had declared him dead to cover the error. Walsh's voice exploded through the intercom. Dr. Kwan, you're making wild accusations based on incomplete information. I made a clinical judgment. Eva's voice cut through, calm, surgical, precise as her hands. The patient's scan times are in the chart. What time did you order the contrast CT? Kwan checked the tablet. 2:14 a.m. Eva placed another suture. And what time was the chest X-ray? Kwan scrolled again. His voice was barely a whisper. There isn't one. The observation room erupted. Whispers became shouts. Nurses pulling up protocols on their phones. Residents checking medical guidelines. Everyone suddenly understanding what they were witnessing. Not just a surgery, a cover-up. Feldman turned to Walsh. Her voice was ice. Dr. Walsh, is this true? Walsh's face went from red to purple to white. I made a clinical judgment based on 30 years of experience. I don't need a chest X-ray to diagnose. Kowalski's voice cut through like a blade. You nearly killed my son to hide your mistake. Eva blocked it all out. The chaos, the accusations, the politics, none of it mattered. Only the patient mattered. Only the surgery mattered. Final suture on the mesenteric artery. Perfect, clean. bleeding controlled. 4:44 a.m. She began closing the abdomen, layer by layer, peritoneum, fascia, subcutaneous tissue, skin. Patel's voice held wonder, BP rising, 95/60, 105/75, 1910/70, stabilizing. The monitor showed a strong, steady rhythm. No alarms, no alerts. Just the regular beep of a functioning heart. A living patient. Ava placed the last suture, stepped back, pulled off her gloves. Her hands were steady, completely steady. He's going to make it. The observation room exploded in spontaneous applause, nurses crying, residents staring in awe. Even hardened ER veterans who'd seen everything were wiping their eyes. Kwan stared at Eva across the operating table. That was extraordinary. I've never seen anything like that. Eva pulled off her surgical mask, the weight of 7 years lifting, not gone, never gone, but lighter, manageable, transformed into something that resembled purpose instead of guilt. She looked at her hands, really looked at them, at the steadiness, at the capability, at the muscle memory that had waited 7 years to be needed again. Neither have I. Not in a long time. In the observation room, Walsh stood frozen. Feldman was already on her phone. Security was talking into their radios. Kowalski watched Eva with something that looked like respect, like gratitude, like recognition. The patient's monitor beeped steadily. Strong, alive, saved. Eva had made it 341, 5:23 a.m., post-op area, cold, quiet, empty except for Eva. She sat alone on a bench, scrubs still bloodied, exhausted down to her bones, the kind of exhaustion that came after adrenaline burned through your system and left nothing but ash. Her hands were shaking again. Now that it was over. Now that the patient was stable. Now that the crisis had passed and muscle memory released its grip. The shaking was different this time. Not fear, not doubt, just the body's natural response to what had happened, to what she'd done, to 7 years of silence ending in a single surgery. She thought of Morrison, of Kandahar, of the choice she'd made and the guilt she'd carried, of 7 years spent hiding in supply closets and night shifts because she couldn't forgive herself for saving 3 men instead of 4. Footsteps approached. Kwan appeared in the doorway. Still in surgical scrubs, eyes tired but bright. Patient stable. ICU has him. He's going to make a full recovery. Eva nodded. Couldn't speak yet. The words were trapped somewhere between relief and something she didn't have a name for. Kwan sat beside her. Didn't say anything else. Just sat. Sometimes that was enough. 6:15 a.m. Administrator's office, conference room. Eva expected termination, expected legal threats, expected consequences for breaking protocol and performing surgery without credentials. She walked in and stopped. The room was full. Karen Feldman, hospital administrator, legal counsel in an expensive suit, board representative with a tablet full of charts, Admiral Kowalski, now properly identified with his full title, Rear Admiral retired James Kowalski, former Surgeon General of the Navy, and Dr. Walsh sitting in the corner, looking smaller than Eva had ever seen him, diminished, like someone had taken all the authority and arrogance and drained it away, leaving just an old man who'd made a terrible mistake. Feldman stood. Ms. Winters. Or should I say, Dr. Winters, we owe you an apology. Eva blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected. Legal counsel spoke next, measured, professional, but with genuine respect underneath. What happened tonight was extraordinary. You saved a life under impossible circumstances. You demonstrated surgical skill that most attending surgeons would envy. The board representative pulled up charts on the tablet, turned it so Eva could see. We've reviewed everything. Dr. Walsh's procedural errors are significant. The missed chest X-ray, the inappropriate contrast CT, the premature declaration of death. Any one of these would be concerning. Together, they represent a pattern of dangerous negligence. Walsh spoke, quiet, defeated. I'm submitting my resignation. Eva looked at him, expected to feel triumph, vindication, the satisfaction of watching someone who'd dismissed her face consequences. She felt nothing except tired. I didn't do this for vindication. I did it because a patient needed help. Kowalski stood, moved to the center of the room. When he spoke, His voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent a lifetime making hard decisions. "Dr. Winters, you've been hiding for 7 years." Ava met his eyes. "I was at your tribunal. I fought for you. That decision was wrong. Captain Morrison's death wasn't your fault. You made the right call. 3 men lived because of your choice. That's not failure. That's mathematics. That's triage. That's combat surgery." He paused. Let the words sink in. "Morrison's family wrote letters supporting you after the tribunal. Did you know that? They never blamed you. His wife, his daughters, they all wrote letters saying you'd made the right choice, that you'd saved lives, that their husband and father would have wanted you to keep saving lives." Ava felt tears coming. 7 years of holding them back, 7 years of guilt and shame and self-imposed exile. "I blame myself." Kowalski's voice softened. "I know, but it's time to stop." Feldman cleared her throat. "Business, moving forward. Dr. Winters, Cedar Memorial would like to offer you a position, attending trauma surgeon, full credentials, full privileges." Ava shook her head automatically. "I'm not credentialed. My surgical privileges were revoked." Feldman smiled. "We can fix that. Your military record speaks for itself. 347 successful surgeries, 98% survival rate, and after tonight, after what we all witnessed, there's no question about your competence." The board representative nodded. "We need surgeons like you. We need leaders like you. People who act when action is needed. People who save lives instead of protecting careers." Ava looked at her hands, at the steadiness returning, thought of 7 years of hiding, of night shifts, of cleaning supplies in supply closets, of becoming invisible because she couldn't face what she'd lost. But she also thought of Morrison, and of the 340 men and women who'd lived, and of tonight, of John Doe, of 341. "I need to think about it." "Huh." Kowalski smiled. Like he'd expected that answer. "Fair enough. But while you're thinking, I have another offer." He pulled out a folder. "Official Navy letterhead. The Navy's developing a new combat trauma training program. We need someone who's been there, someone who can teach the next generation not just the procedures, but how to make the impossible choices, how to do triage when everyone's dying, how to live with the decisions afterward." He slid the folder across the table. "Consultant position, civilian, no deployment, no active duty, just training, teaching, turn your worst moment into something that saves lives." Ava stared at the folder, at both offers, at 2 paths forward after 7 years of standing still. "Both offers. Can I do both?" Kowalski's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd ask." 1 week later, Ava walked through Cedar Memorial's emergency room. Different now, not in the janitorial scrubs that had marked her as invisible, in surgical scrubs. Attending physician badge clipped to her collar, staff nodded as she passed, respectful, acknowledging. Some with awe, some with gratitude, all with recognition. She was visible again. She stopped by Trauma 3, the room where everything had changed, where 7 years of hiding had ended in 11 minutes of surgery. A young man sat up in the hospital bed, recovering, color back in his face, life in his eyes. Lieutenant Marcus Kowalski, the Admiral's son. John Doe, given a name and a future. "You're the one who saved me." Eva stepped into the room. "Your father told you?" Marcus nodded. "He told me everything. About Kandahar, about Captain Morrison, about you hiding for 7 years because you couldn't forgive yourself for making the right choice." He met her eyes. "Thank you for not hiding when I needed you." Ava felt the weight shift, not gone, never gone, but transformed into something bearable. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stop." 3 months later, Naval Medical Center San Diego, bright California sun streaming through windows, the smell of antiseptic and determination. Ava stood at the front of a classroom. Not a classroom exactly, a simulation room, multiple trauma dummies, monitors, equipment, everything needed to recreate the chaos of combat surgery. 20 young surgeons in training, fresh, eager, terrified. She ran them through a simulation, mass casualty event, multiple patients, limited resources, impossible choices. One of the young surgeons froze, staring at 3 critical patients, hands shaking, voice breaking. "I can't save them all." Eva stepped forward, Her voice was calm, certain, the voice of someone who'd been there, who'd made the choices, who'd lived with the consequences. You're right, you can't. So you make the choice. You save who you can save. You do the math, you do the triage, you make the call. She moved between the simulation dummies. And then you live with it. You honor the ones you lost by saving the next one, and the next one, and the next one after that. 98% survival rate means 2% die. Some will die. But you focus on the 98% who lived. The young surgeon nodded, hands steadying, understanding dawning. Ava's office at the Naval Medical Center was small but filled with meaning. Commendations on the wall, photos from Kandahar, current class photos, letters from former students now deployed and saving lives. One new addition sat on her desk. A letter, handwritten, from Morrison's daughters, 16 and 18 now, old enough to understand, old enough to write. Our father would be proud of what you're doing. Thank you for carrying his memory forward. Thank you for teaching others to make the hard choices. Thank you for not letting his death be the end of your story. Ava touched the letter, felt the weight of 7 years. Not gone, never gone, but transformed. She looked at her hands, steady, confident, ready. 7 years I hid because I couldn't save one man. Now I teach others how to save thousands. That's not redemption, that's mathematics. But maybe it's enough. Her pager buzzed. Emergency alert, mass casualty event incoming, multiple traumas, all hands needed at Cedar Memorial. Eva stood, grabbed her trauma kit, moved with purpose, with confidence, with the certainty of someone who'd found their way back. She ran through the hallway, past a photo on the wall, new program announcement, professional printing, official seal, Combat Trauma Fellowship Program, founded by Dr. Eva Winters and RADM retired James Kowalski. Training the next generation of combat surgeons to save lives under impossible circumstances. Her phone rang as she ran, went to voicemail. Her voice played. "This is Dr. Winters. I'm currently in surgery. If this is an emergency, I'll call you back. If it's not, I'll still call you back." Nobody gets left behind. Ava burst through the doors into the trauma bay. Paramedics wheeling in patients, nurses prepping bays, residents calling out vitals, Quan coordinating triage, controlled chaos, beautiful chaos, the chaos of lives being saved. Ava pulled on gloves, moved to the first gurney, assessed, prioritized, made the calls. Her hands were steady, completely steady, ready.